GM talking about the cars that it imports into the U.S. to sell in the U.S. from some of its international factories. How much of GM sales does this represent?
Well, first of all, good afternoon. Thanks for having me. The ironic thing here is that it's actually very small, and I think GM, more than anything else, as we read this, is really, I think, speaking out more from a public relations perspective in solidarity with its sort of foreign OEM brethren, to the degree that China, which is the world's largest auto market, not the U.S., is going to be important to GM's future. I think it behooves them to, get everybody on the same page. So I think this is more about rhetoric and posturing, and we believe GM and Ford and other domestic manufacturers in other industries very much have the administration's ear. So this came as a little bit of a shock to us. We had thought they were more working along the lines of trying to make sure the administration knows quite the severity of the impact that these types of tariffs could have. This would seem in striking contrast to that cooperation that we anticipated they would have with the administration.
Yeah, it's interesting, Jamie, because they're clearly lobbying behind the scenes, and all of these big car makers and broader industries will be doing that too. So in light of the fact that it actually surprises you that they've stepped up at this time, does this suggest some increasing element of alarm, particularly in light of what we're seeing from the likes of Canada? We've already seen it from the EU. We've seen it from China. That the thing does feel like it's escalating.
Yeah, I think reading it at a very high level, I would agree with that. But at the same time, this is extraordinarily complicated. We're talking about tariffs in and out of the EU, in and out of China. There's a separate sort of discussion going on about the potential reorganization of NAFTA. We've spoken very recently with GM, and we asked them sort of what their wish would be. Would it be to leave NAFTA alone, or to try and find some way of reorganizing it or updating it? And they said the latter. And so I do think there's a lot of different moving pieces here. It just seems an odd time and a fairly thinly veiled release. There's not a heck of a lot of depth to it. And so we're a little bit curious as to why now, more than anything else. But at the end of the day, GM doesn't import that many vehicles. They've talked down the negative impacts to their own business. So this does seem a lot more like trying to show solidarity for their foreign peers.
Right. It does seem interesting that they would want to put themselves in the line of fire, so to speak, from the administration on this issue. Jamie, in the case of Harley-Davidson, for example, some analysts have suggested that the underlying business is not going great there. And so some of their decision to shift production is also reflective of that. Can we make any kind of similar conclusion about General Motors, about what it tells us about the health of their business right now?
It's interesting you bring that up. Ironically, a smaller GM might even be a more profitable GM. And, when you look at the core business, I do, and myself and my team really believe that as the cycle, continues into the next decade, we're going to see much more focus on utility vehicles and trucks and away from cars. And then separately, and what GM has already said, is they're going to start carving out in more financial detail their investments in cruise automation. So there's an autonomous sort of a technology call here as well. So, it's sort of ironic. I do think a smaller GM might actually be a better GM for investors. So I don't know that, well, I should say, I don't know Harley-Davidson. I don't cover Harley-Davidson, so I don't know them that closely. But there might be a similarity there from where we sit.
Jamie, two things here. I mean, you've pointed out actually that for GM specifically, longer term, they depend far more on Chinese demand than the United States. And so that's part of surely the calculation that they're making here, and the hopes that actually greater damage isn't done in the future. Your equal weight right now, you've got a $45 target. At what point do you have to rethink perhaps your current stance on GM in light of the concerns that the company itself is voicing at this moment?
I think it's a great question. GM right now, and I think the frustration that management would share if they were on the line with us now is that, they're getting these sort of late cycle multiples when, U.S. sales are holding up pretty well. China's still growing very well. They've reorganized and pulled out of Europe. They're doing a lot of the right things in terms of returning capital to shareholders. So interestingly, there isn't I don't think a ton of downside from a valuation perspective. It's a question of, can they show some real momentum on the autonomous and sort of the connectivity side of the business? Can that start to drive monetization? So in our mind, we're actually less concerned on the downside, even withstanding these tariff debates. We would hope that we end up in a world that's freer and fairer than we were prior. But certainly, we think there's also a very positive opportunity on the technology side. And so we're more cautiously optimistic than cautiously pessimistic, if you will.
GM's got broad shoulders. Do you think they've opened the floodgates here for other car makers during earnings season to voice their own concerns?
I think that's possible. But again, this feels like a debate that's going on in the public relations department and not sort of in the chief financial officer's office right now. I don't think this is a financial announcement. I think this is more posturing, and so to the degree that others feel the need to voice their concerns for whatever reason, public facing opinion or to show solidarity with their peers, they may. But I don't think this really changes anything, quite frankly. It's so thinly worded and so high level that there's not a lot I don't think we can take from it financially.